Man saves a pregnant pit bull, and 3 years later, she reappears with an emotional surprise. Sometimes, a single act of kindness can create ripples that last a lifetime. This is the story of a man who went out of his way to save a pregnant pit bull, giving her a second chance at life. But what happened 3 years later will leave you speechless. Get ready for an unforgettable journey of loyalty, love, and an emotional surprise that will touch your heart. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories that inspire and move you. The storm had rolled in fast, transforming the late evening into a chaotic swirl of wind and rain. Daniel adjusted his hood, squinting against the downpour as he made his way home. He'd taken this route 100 times before, a quiet path that cut through the outskirts of town, but tonight, something felt different. The usual rustling of trees and distant hum of traffic were drowned out by the howling wind. As he approached a stretch of abandoned buildings, a sound broke through the storm, a faint whimper, barely audible above the rain. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. He turned toward the noise, his eyes scanning the shadows. Then he saw her. Huddled beneath a crumbling awning was a pit bull, her frame thin and shaking. Her dull brown coat clung to her body, soaked through from the rain. But what struck Daniel the most was her eyes, wide, pleading, and filled with a desperation that made his chest tighten. As he stepped closer, she let out a low growl, her body trembling with both fear and exhaustion. "It's okay," Daniel said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog didn't move, her gaze fixed on him as he crouched down a few feet away. That's when he noticed her swollen belly. She was pregnant, and from the looks of it, not far from giving birth. The thought of her trying to survive in these conditions, alone and vulnerable, sent a wave of urgency through him. "You need help," he murmured, inching closer. "And I'm not leaving you out here." For a moment he thought she might bolt, but then her growl softened into a whine. Slowly, carefully, Daniel removed his jacket and draped it over her shivering form. She flinched at first, but as the warmth enveloped her, she let out a small sigh, her body relaxing slightly. "It's going to be okay," he promised, gently stroking her head. "Let's get you out of this rain." It took patience and coaxing, but eventually she allowed him to lift her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her ribs prominent beneath her wet fur. Carrying her carefully, Daniel hurried back to his truck, shielding her as best he could from the rain. Once inside, he turned up the heat and laid her on the passenger seat, wrapping her in a blanket he kept in the back. She looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and trust, her eyes heavy but watchful. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Daniel drove straight to the nearest veterinary clinic, his mind racing with questions. How long had she been out there? Was she injured? And most pressing of all, would she and her pups survive? The clinic was quiet when he arrived, the storm keeping most people indoors. A vet tech greeted him, her eyes widening when she saw the dog in his arms. "She's pregnant," Daniel explained quickly. "I found her out in the storm. She needs help." The tech nodded, leading him to an exam room where the veterinarian, Dr. Miller, quickly got to work. As Daniel watched from the corner, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. How many people had walked past her without stopping? How many had ignored her cries for help? "She's malnourished and dehydrated," Dr. Miller said after a thorough exam. "But she's strong. With some care, she and her puppies should be okay." Relief flooded through Daniel as he nodded. "I'll cover whatever she needs." Dr. Miller smiled. "You're doing a good thing." Daniel stayed with the dog, whom he had started calling Ruby, as she received fluids and a warm bed to rest in. He stroked her head gently, his voice low and soothing. "You're not alone anymore, Ruby. We'll get through this." As the hours passed, Ruby seemed to relax, her eyes closing as she drifted into a peaceful sleep. Daniel couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about her stirred a protectiveness in him he hadn't felt in years. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside calm and still. Ruby's condition had stabilized, and Dr. Miller assured him that she was in good hands. But, as Daniel prepared to leave, a thought struck him. "What happens to her after this?" he asked. The vet tech hesitated. "If she doesn't have an owner, she'll likely end up in a shelter." Daniel looked at Ruby, her eyes opening slightly, as if sensing his hesitation. In that moment, he made a decision. "She's coming home with me," he said firmly. And just like that, Ruby's life changed forever. The ride home from the clinic was quiet, but the air between Daniel and Ruby felt lighter. She lay curled on the passenger seat, still wrapped in the blanket he'd brought, her eyes occasionally flicking toward him, as if trying to make sense of this new reality. Daniel couldn't stop glancing at her, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. "You're safe now, Ruby," he said softly, as if the words could erase the pain she had endured. When they arrived at his small house on the edge of town, Ruby hesitated at the door, her thin frame visibly trembling. Daniel crouched beside her, holding out his hand. "Come on, girl, it's okay. This is your home now." After a moment, she stepped inside cautiously, her nails clicking against the hardwood floor. Her nose twitched as she sniffed the air, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Daniel let her take her time, watching as she explored her new surroundings. He had already prepared a cozy corner for her, a soft bed with a blanket, a bowl of fresh water, and a dish of food. Ruby approached it slowly, her movements uncertain, before finally settling onto the bed with a small sigh. It was the first time he saw her truly relax, and the sight filled him with a quiet sense of victory. Over the next few days, Daniel focused on helping Ruby adjust. Her past had clearly left scars, both physical and emotional. She flinched at sudden movements, her eyes darting nervously whenever the sound of footsteps echoed outside. But little by little, her trust began to grow. Every morning, Daniel would sit beside her bed, offering her pieces of cooked chicken. At first, she hesitated, her body tense, as if bracing for something bad. But as the days passed, her reluctance gave way to cautious acceptance. By the end of the week, she was eating out of his hand, her eyes softening in a way that made his chest ache. "You're a fighter, Ruby," he said one evening, stroking her head as they sat together on the couch. "Whatever you've been through, you're still here. That's something." Ruby's belly continued to grow, a reminder of the new lives she carried within her. Daniel researched everything he could about caring for a pregnant dog, determined to give her the best chance at a healthy delivery. He built a whelping box in the corner of the living room, lining it with soft blankets and placing it in a quiet, comfortable spot. As the days turned into weeks, Ruby's personality began to shine. She followed Daniel around the house, her tail wagging tentatively whenever he spoke to her. At night, she would curl up on her bed, but keep her eyes on him, as if afraid he might disappear. One evening, as they sat together watching TV, Ruby surprised him by resting her head on his lap. The gesture was small, but it was the first time she had sought affection on her own terms. Daniel froze for a moment, his hand hovering above her head, before gently stroking her fur. "You're really something, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Ruby's eyes closed, her breathing steady and calm. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. Late one night, as a storm raged outside, Ruby began to pace. Daniel woke to the sound of her nails clicking on the floor and immediately knew something was wrong. He found her near the whelping box, her body trembling. "It's time, isn't it?" he asked, crouching beside her. Ruby looked up at him, her eyes filled with both fear and trust. The hours that followed were a whirlwind. Daniel stayed by her side, guiding her through the process with the help of advice from the vet and the articles he'd read. Ruby was a fighter, enduring the pain with a quiet strength that left him in awe. By dawn, the house was filled with the soft whimpers of newborn puppies. Ruby lay curled around them, her body exhausted but her eyes filled with something Daniel could only describe as peace. He sat beside her, marveling at the tiny lives she had brought into the world. "You did it, Ruby," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're incredible." Ruby looked up at him, her tail thumping weakly against the floor. In that moment, Daniel knew that saving her had been the best decision he had ever made. The house was no longer quiet. The once empty living room now echoed with the tiny yips and squeaks of Ruby's puppies. There were 6 of them, each as unique as their mother. Some with her warm brown coat, others with white patches on their paws or chests. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, watching them stumble over one another in clumsy play. Ruby lay nearby, her head resting on her paws as she watched Daniel with her soft, amber eyes. Her gaze seemed different now, calmer, almost grateful. It was as if she understood that this life, this warmth and safety, wasn't just hers anymore. It was for her pups, too. "You've got quite the crew here, Ruby," Daniel said, scratching behind her ears. She responded with a quiet huff, her tail wagging lazily against the floor. The days that followed were a whirlwind of feeding schedules, vet visits, and endless cleanups. Daniel threw himself into the role of caregiver, dividing his time between work and the puppies. It wasn't easy, but the sight of their tiny tails wagging or their high-pitched barks of excitement made every sleepless night worth it. Ruby, too, seemed to thrive. Her coat grew shinier, her frame filled out, and her once guarded demeanor softened. She became more playful, often nudging Daniel's hand with her nose to demand attention or joining her pups in their chaotic games. But for all the joy the puppies brought, Daniel knew he couldn't keep them all. As they grew, it became clear that they needed homes of their own, places where they could thrive and be loved as much as Ruby was. It was a bittersweet process, finding the right families. Daniel interviewed potential adopters carefully, ensuring each pup would go to a home where they would be cherished. Ruby watched the process quietly, her eyes following each pup as they left with their new families. When the last puppy was adopted, Ruby seemed subdued. She wandered the house as if searching for them, her tail drooping slightly. Daniel understood her sadness. It mirrored his own, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. "You still have me," he reminded her one evening, sitting beside her on the couch. She leaned against him, her head resting on his lap as he stroked her fur. "And I'll always have you." Months turned into years, and Ruby became Daniel's constant companion. They went everywhere together, on hikes through the woods, trips to the local park, even just lazy afternoons in the backyard. Ruby's loyalty was unwavering, and Daniel often marveled at how much she had changed his life. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One chilly morning, as Daniel sipped his coffee by the window, he noticed Ruby standing near the gate, her ears perked and her body tense. She let out a low whine, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "What is it, girl?" he asked, setting down his mug and stepping outside. Ruby didn't move, her gaze unwavering. Daniel followed her line of sight, his heart skipping a beat when he saw a figure approaching. At first, he thought it might be a neighbor, but as they came closer, he realized it was something far more unexpected. It was one of Ruby's pups. Fully grown now, the dog was nearly identical to Ruby, with the same warm brown coat and soulful eyes. Behind him, 2 smaller figures trailed, a woman and a child, their faces cautious but kind. Daniel's chest tightened as the realization sank in. He looked down at Ruby, whose tail wagged furiously as she pressed herself against the gate, whining with excitement. "Ruby, it's him," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. The woman stepped forward, her hand resting on the dog's head. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice tentative, "but I think this boy here belongs to someone you know." Daniel's heart swelled as the dog approached, sniffing the air around Ruby before nuzzling against her. Tears stung his eyes as he watched the reunion, a lump forming in his throat. Life had come full circle in a way Daniel could never have predicted. Ruby was electric with excitement, her tail wagging so hard it shook her entire body. She let out a series of high-pitched whines, pressing her nose against the gate as if trying to get closer to her grown pup. The dog responded in kind, nudging her through the bars and licking her face. It was a moment so pure, so full of joy, that Daniel couldn't hold back a smile, even as his throat tightened with emotion. The woman standing behind the dog looked hesitant, her eyes flicking between Daniel and Ruby. "I didn't mean to just show up like this," she began, "but I had to bring him. He's been restless for weeks, pacing and whining every time we passed this area. I finally followed his lead and here we are." Daniel's gaze shifted to the dog, who now stood proudly beside Ruby, their similarities impossible to ignore. "He remembered," Daniel said softly, more to himself than anyone else. He crouched down, his hand outstretched. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing before allowing Daniel to stroke his head. "What's his name?" Daniel asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Buddy," the woman replied with a small smile. "But it seems like he had a life before he was ours." Daniel nodded, still stroking Buddy's fur. Ruby remained close, her eyes flicking between her pup and Daniel, as if checking to make sure this was real. Inside the house, the reunion continued. Ruby and Buddy stuck close to each other, playing and nuzzling, as if no time had passed. The woman, who introduced herself as Lisa, sat at the kitchen table with her son, a curious boy of about 6. They watched the dogs with smiles, though Lisa's eyes held a hint of concern. "You said he was one of her puppies?" Lisa asked, sipping the tea Daniel had offered. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Ruby had 6 pups. I made sure they all went to good homes, but I never thought I'd see one of them again." "How did you come to adopt him?" Lisa sighed, glancing at her son, who was busy scratching Buddy's ears. "He was at a shelter, not long after we moved here. They told us he'd been surrendered, though they didn't say why. My son fell in love with him immediately, and I couldn't say no." Daniel's heart sank. The idea that Buddy had been abandoned, even briefly, filled him with a wave of guilt. "I thought I found him a good home," he murmured. "I didn't know." Lisa shook her head quickly. "Don't blame yourself. If anything, you saved him twice. First, by giving him a chance at life, and then by making sure he found his way to us." Her words offered some comfort, but Daniel's thoughts were already spinning. How many other pups had faced similar fates? Had he truly done enough for them? As evening fell, Lisa and her son prepared to leave. Buddy hesitated at the door, his gaze fixed on Ruby. Daniel knelt beside him, stroking his head gently. "You've got a good family now, Buddy," he said. "Take care of them." Ruby whined softly, nudging Buddy's side. The 2 dogs shared one last nuzzle before Lisa led Buddy outside. Daniel watched from the porch as they walked away, Ruby sitting beside him with her ears perked and her tail still. She's proud of him, Daniel thought, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. But as Ruby leaned into his side, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. Something told him that life had another surprise in store, one that would test the strength of their bond in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Weeks passed, and life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Ruby seemed content, though Daniel couldn't help but notice her spending more time near the gate, as if expecting Buddy to return. Her energy hadn't waned. She still greeted him with wagging tails and playful nudges every morning, but there was a quietness in her moments alone that hadn't been there before. One crisp morning, as Daniel was preparing coffee, Ruby let out a low, mournful howl from the yard. Alarmed, Daniel rushed outside to find her lying near the gate, her body still but her eyes wide with a mix of anticipation and sadness. She wasn't looking toward the road this time. She was focused on him. "What's wrong, girl?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside her. Ruby let out a soft whimper, resting her head on his lap. Her body felt heavier than usual, her warmth seeping into his hands as he stroked her fur. He had seen her tired before, but this was different. She wasn't just tired, she was weary. At the vet later that day, Daniel sat in the waiting room, his leg bouncing anxiously as he clutched Ruby's leash. She lay beside him, her breathing steady but slower than normal. Dr. Miller, the same vet who had helped deliver Ruby's puppies years ago, finally called them in. After a thorough examination, Dr. Miller sat across from Daniel, her expression solemn. "Ruby's been showing symptoms that concern me," she began gently. "We'll need to run some tests, but I'm worried it could be something serious." Daniel's heart sank. "What kind of serious?" Dr. Miller hesitated. "Given her age and the symptoms, it might be cancer. But let's not jump to conclusions yet. We'll know more once we get the results." The word hung in the air like a weight Daniel couldn't shake. Cancer. It was the one thing he couldn't protect her from, no matter how much he tried. The next few days were a blur of tests and waiting. Ruby stayed by Daniel's side through it all, her calm demeanor both comforting and heartbreaking. She seemed to sense his unease, offering quiet reassurances with her steady presence. When the call from Dr. Miller finally came, Daniel's worst fears were confirmed. Ruby had an aggressive form of lymphoma. The prognosis was bleak. Weeks, maybe a few months if treatment went well. Daniel sat on the couch that evening, Ruby's head resting on his lap as tears streamed down his face. "I don't know what I'm going to do without you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Ruby looked up at him with those same amber eyes that had captivated him the day he found her in the storm. She nudged his hand, her tail thumping weakly against the floor. It was as if she was telling him it would be okay. Determined to make her final days as joyful as possible, Daniel devoted every moment to Ruby. They went on walks in her favorite park, shared quiet mornings on the porch, and even made a trip to the beach, a place Ruby had never seen before. She wagged her tail at the crashing waves, her nose twitching as she took in the salty air. But with each passing day, her energy waned. The spark in her eyes dimmed, though her love for Daniel never faltered. As he sat with her one evening, stroking her fur, he felt a weight settle over him, a quiet acceptance of what was to come. "You've given me so much, Ruby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I just hope I've done enough for you." Ruby let out a soft sigh, her eyes closing as she leaned into his touch. Daniel stayed with her long into the night, holding her close as the stars flickered above. The morning came softly, the golden light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Daniel stirred awake, his senses immediately alert to the quiet presence near his bed. Ruby lay there, her body stretched out on her favorite blanket. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with labored effort, but her eyes open to meet his. That same warmth and trust that had defined their years together shone faintly, even as her strength ebbed away. "Hey, girl," Daniel whispered, sliding off the bed to kneel beside her. His voice trembled, a knot of emotion tightening in his throat. "I'm here." Ruby's tail gave a faint wag, brushing against the floor, as if she was reassuring him, not the other way around. Daniel reached out, his hand resting gently on her head. Her fur was still soft, though thinner now, and she leaned into his touch as she had so many times before. The house was still, save for the quiet symphony of early morning, the distant chirping of birds, the faint rustle of leaves outside. But inside, the moment felt suspended in time. Daniel's heart ached as he watched Ruby, her once vibrant energy now a shadow of what it had been. He knew this day would come, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of it. "You've been so brave," he said, his voice cracking. "You've done so much, Ruby. More than I could ever thank you for." Ruby blinked slowly, her amber eyes fixed on him. Her breathing grew slower, each exhale a soft sigh. Daniel stayed with her, stroking her fur and whispering words of comfort. Memories flooded his mind. The stormy night he found her, the joy of seeing her puppies grow, the countless moments of love and companionship they had shared. He remembered how Ruby had saved him as much as he had saved her. Before she came into his life, Daniel had been adrift, going through the motions, but feeling an emptiness he couldn't quite name. Ruby had filled that void, her unwavering loyalty and unconditional love reminding him of what it meant to truly connect with another being. The hours passed in a blur. Ruby drifted in and out of sleep, her body nestled against Daniel's as he sat beside her. He didn't move, didn't care about the numbness spreading through his legs or the ache in his back. All that mattered was being there for her, as she had always been there for him. By mid-afternoon, Ruby's breathing became shallower, each rise and fall of her chest more labored than the last. Daniel's hands shook as he stroked her head, his voice steady, despite the tears streaming down his face. "You can rest now, Ruby," he said softly. "It's okay. You've done enough." Ruby let out a soft whine, her tail giving one last, faint wag. She closed her eyes, her body relaxing fully for the first time in days. Daniel felt the moment she slipped away, a profound stillness settling over her. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stayed there, his hand resting on Ruby's head as tears fell freely. The weight of her absence pressed down on him, a void he knew would never truly be filled. The next few days passed in a haze. Daniel buried Ruby in a quiet corner of his backyard, beneath the large oak tree where she had loved to lie on sunny afternoons. He marked the spot with a small wooden plaque, her name etched into it with care. Ruby, forever loved. Friends and neighbors stopped by to offer their condolences, but words felt hollow in the face of his grief. The house, once filled with Ruby's presence, felt empty and unbearably quiet. Her bed remained untouched, her leash still hanging by the door. Daniel couldn't bring himself to put them away. He found solace in small rituals, watering the flowers near her grave, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, as he used to when Ruby would lie at his feet. But the ache in his chest persisted, a constant reminder of what he had lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the name and address were clear. Lisa and Buddy. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it, unfolding the neatly written note inside. "Dear Daniel, we heard about Ruby, and we're so sorry for your loss. Buddy hasn't been himself lately. He's restless, as if he knows something is missing. Ruby was more than just his mother. She was part of his soul, just like she was part of yours. Buddy wants to see you. If you're open to it, we'd love to visit and spend some time with you. We believe it might bring some peace to all of us. With love, Lisa and Buddy." Daniel held the letter tightly, his emotions a mix of sorrow and gratitude. The thought of seeing Buddy again stirred something in him, a faint glimmer of hope amidst the darkness of his grief. The following weekend, Lisa and Buddy arrived. Daniel's heart ached as he saw Buddy leap out of the car, his frame larger but unmistakably Ruby's. The dog bounded toward Daniel, his tail wagging furiously. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a genuine smile tug at his lips. Lisa watched as Buddy pressed himself against Daniel, his nose sniffing every inch of his old surroundings. "He's been so eager to see you," she said, her voice warm. "I think he knew you needed him." Daniel nodded, crouching to hug Buddy tightly. The dog's presence was a balm for his aching heart, a reminder that Ruby's legacy lived on in ways he hadn't fully realized. As the evening wore on, they sat on the porch together, Buddy lying at Daniel's feet. The stars above shone brightly, and for the first time in weeks, the quiet didn't feel so heavy. Daniel looked at Buddy, his hand resting on the dog's head. "Thank you, Buddy," he whispered, "for bringing a piece of her back to me." And in that moment, surrounded by the memories of Ruby and the warmth of her son, Daniel felt a flicker of peace, a reminder that while grief may never fully fade, love endures in the most unexpected ways. Ruby's story reminds us of the deep bonds we share with our animals and the enduring legacy of their love. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who understands the special connection between humans and their pets. Together, let's honor their loyalty and celebrate the courage and love they bring into our lives.